Q&A would be good.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and we're up. Welcome everybody to the June 2020 Sydney Microsoft 365 Meetup. I'm Ken Josling, your presenter for today. I'm joined behind the scenes by my colleague Peter, who is going to help with some of the Q&A stuff. Unfortunately, fortunately rather, Ashish has taken a step away this month because he's going to be a dad. So we're going to let him bow out for a bit and take on more challenging responsibilities. So without further ado, I'll get stuck into the content for today. So we're going to cover a couple of new features in Office 365 just briefly before we start into the main topic today, which is going to be around information architecture and how we can use some of the practices to plan for Microsoft Teams deployment. And we're going to go through a real life example that we've worked on here at Telstra Purple around this concept of what we call a customer site. We're going to wrap up at the top of the hour with a Q&A. If you have any questions on the live stream, please do post those using the Q&A function on your mobile device or in your browser. My colleague Peter will moderate those and we'll get around to answering as many of those as we can at the end of the session. Do be aware that because it's a live stream, you are hearing what I am saying to you 20 seconds after I am saying it to you. So Peter's here on hand to let me know if there are any technical glitches or difficulties with the transmission, given the quality of the internet today is moderately poor where I am currently based at home. All right, so one excellent new feature that's come into Office 365 is now the ability to present live in PowerPoint online. So typically what would normally happen is somebody would share their screen via Teams or Skype and run through the slides that way, and there would be limited opportunity for people to interact with the content. So what you have here is, and this is an ability of PowerPoint Online. So using the browser, you can present now live the content to either people in your organization, in your tenant, or to anyone. And what that does is it's similar to a Teams live event in the sense that when people receive that invitation, or if they're in that meeting, they're actually given an opportunity to scan a QR code, and what that QR code will do, you can also type in a short URL as well that you can provide to people, so they can join using the QR code, they can join using the short-term URL, and that gives them the ability to jump in and view. It sort of gives them a copy of your presentation. Now there are some real perks with this. One, it starts to automatically translate the language that you're speaking over the line into one of up to 60 other languages. So users can set a preference to the language that they would like to hear your content delivered in, and the translation happens on the fly. That's a really, really cool feature. Secondly, people can actually go back to previous slides. So while you're busy giving the presentation, there's an ability for people to interact with the presentation as you're talking, whether that's to traverse it backwards or only backwards. So they can't go forward in the presentation to slides that you haven't done yet. They can only go and review slides that you previously talked to. The second thing is that you have limited interactions with the deck as well. So you can zoom in, you can focus on particular areas of the slides. You know, in addition to adding a load of accessibility features, for example, the auto transcription. So subtitles you are automatically generated. So it's a really cool way to present content across your organization and to the public, where, for example, you don't want to use something like a Teams live event. The URL at the bottom there provides more about this feature. It's just literally been launched. It's available in our tenant. A few of the features aren't working correctly, but that's sort of synonymous with it being in early access and under preview. So if it is available, I strongly encourage you to go and have a look at it and see what you think. Secondly, it's worth noting that, and I hit this problem all the time, I'm Googling all the time for image assets, icons, logos, and you always have to tread the fine line of whether or not you're breaking any copyright rules in taking the content that have been, you know, published or leased by somebody else. So what you have now within Office 365 is you have a huge stock library of images. Again, this is being rolled into the online versions of of products of the Office apps. If you go to the pictures menu, you will now see a little drop down arrow, and you can select from that to insert stock images. And the way the stock images are organized is you can do it by, you can have icons, you can have stickers, various things like that. So no longer am I in Paint Shop Pro or Microsoft Paint fiddling around with graphics and things like that. I can choose now from a set of royalty-free images. There's another really cool feature that works, I guess, in conjunction with this, and this is the ability for Office apps now to automatically generate a caption for the image that you insert. So this is not just for stock images, this is for anything that you might insert from your desktop or an asset from OneDrive. But as it inserts the image, it generates a caption for that image based on a machine learning algorithm determining what that image is of, right? And naturally, you're going to want to go away and play with this. And the one thing I would say is use these two images. So the homework, if you like, is go and pick either one of these images and then see what Office thinks the image is of. So whether it's a pug or a muffin, or whether it's a dog or Saruman out of Lord of the Rings. And that is a true test, in my opinion, of whether the algorithm is lifelike or not. But it's a good little exercise to go away and do. And you can do that now. That functionality has been launched into the product. In terms of events that are coming up, it's been a bit of a quiet month. So the only other user groups that have actually mentioned that they're running an event are the Sydney group and the Microsoft 365 adoption group. But neither group, at the time that I produced the slide, had actually announced a topic. But if you're interested in joining those groups, you can register using the links in the deck that I'll provide. And they typically, like us, they'll run a session once a month, and naturally everybody is still online given the current circumstances. So do check those out if you have the time. All right, without further ado, we'll go on to the main presentation. As I said, it's yours truly this month, and I'm going to be talking about information architecture and the process that you go through essentially to implement something like a Microsoft Teams solution in a way that it allows for the content to be managed effectively. And I'm going to sort of treat this presentation in two blocks. So the first section of the presentation is really going to talk about the process and the discipline, and it's going to talk about some of the terminology. And there might be some of you on the call that are really keen to look at what are the capabilities of Teams, how do we use them, and that is going to be the latter half of the presentation. So the first thing is I'm going to set it up with a bit of context and talk about the problem that we were trying to solve and some of the common issues that we see in the industry. The second section is going to be looking at what are the bits and pieces in the Microsoft 365 Toolbox, specifically around Microsoft Teams, that we can bring to bear when we build and develop knowledge management solutions for our workforce. So I'm going to open up with a very simple problem statement. It is my opinion, and is the general opinion of my peers, that information is becoming fragmented, and naturally the way information is organized and the way systems are laid out today is that information is very disparate, and I think that's a reality. So the very concept that we somehow have to logically bring all this information together or replicate it or copy it so that it can coexist with other information, I think is simply a workaround, because the ability for us, or there are deficiencies in the ability for us to be able to search, analyze, rationalize, and create relationships with that data. So as a result, people move into an Office 365 ecosystem, and there are still many different locations where content can exist, and there isn't really a concrete relationship between that content. And so it hangs on applications like Delve to try and bridge those connections. And the way it does that is it looks at how people are interacting with that content. So that's the kind of current state of play. If we don't really understand what information is out there, the only real way we can engage relevance is to look at how people are interacting with that content, or have a heuristic to that. So we're really concerned here about bringing information together, not physically, but in ways in which that it can be related. And that can often be being able to traverse or search for information from a single location. The other problem here is that there isn't really a common people don't invest in communicating a common language across the business, and I'll go into more details as to what that means. But we're talking here about terminology. What do I mean when I use the term project or customer or person or guest? And it's the misalignment here that can often cause a lot of confusion in terms of working with knowledge and working with other people. So I think that because the information is marshaled and retained in essentially what is disparate silos or repositories or systems, the relationships are never fully realized. And if we're still hanging on to some of the traditional search experiences, like something like Microsoft SharePoint's enterprise search back in the day, they obviously don't have the capabilities that Delve does to bridge those relationships. So ultimately, people find it difficult to find information that's relevant to them or find related information to the information that's relevant to them. So I'm going to talk through a high-level approach that I use when I'm trying to design systems for effective knowledge management, and it's a sort of step-by-step process. So, we agree that information in the modern workplace is disparate, right? Previously, we lacked the means to really integrate the systems that we work with, but now that we're moving to the cloud, the opportunities to integrate are all opened up. There's a lot of potential there. Traditionally, it was either very costly to do, or there were, resulting overheads that were outside of any budget holder's appetite. But now we live in the world of connectors, and so, to me, I would say, in all of this, integration, this is the word that you need as an architect or a developer. This is the word you need to be using often, right? Integration is key. We need for our systems to be able to exchange information. And without that ability, you are essentially creating brick walls between the ability to create relationships between your content. So in terms of my step process, the first step is come to a consensus on the terminology that you're going to use. Start within your project or within your team, and then widen that net, right? That is essential, because that terminology should be consistent across your enterprise. Secondly, it's important before you do any target state work, really get a handle on what the current state entities and relationships are. So we're not talking about systems and technology at this stage. We're saying, this is a customer. This is what we mean by customer. And this is the relationship a customer has with an engagement or an agreement or a guest or a person, and map it out, right? This is an exercise that doesn't require technologists involved. It is really a case of your team trying to make sense of the real world objects that your digital content represents. The third step is assign content to your entities. What information do we store about an opportunity or a customer? What are the attributes? So what content is one thing, attributes or metadata is another. So what are the documents that belong to this entity, and what are the attributes that belong to this entity? And all too often, if you look at this, you'll find, well, actually, these attributes don't belong to this entity, they belong to this entity here, or this content isn't actually applicable to this entity, it might be applicable to many entities. And when you're doing that, work out where those attributes and entities and contents are sourced. So find out where that information currently lives, which system holds it, who owns it, and who's accountable for it. The fourth is to look at your business requirements. So when you build a target state system, or you want to make a change, understand why you're making that change. What are the problems that you're trying to solve? So I've already alluded to the fact that it's hard to find information. So what would it take in order for information to be easily found? How would people be searching or traversing that information? And this is where you have your UX design thinking, human-centered design people come in and workshop with you. So typically you'd be doing this internally, or a partner would be engaged, and you might be working on personas, you might be working on use cases, but that is an important step in the process. But it can happen in parallel with you really understanding what the current state looks like. The fifth step is ensure that you design your target state for referential integrity. Bring stuff together. right? When you surface a lot of disparate information in something like Microsoft Teams, that's not really solving the referential integrity problem. It's just providing a single lens to look at your content. So if you can, create relationships between the content if it is disparate, and use those relationships to bring that information together in a collective view. And the final stage is build it. So in Microsoft Teams, we're going to talk about the various things that you can do, but the key thing here, message here, is integrate, integrate, integrate. So I want to talk about some of the terms as well that we use when we talk about information architecture. Going back to my process that I just described, number one, align on the terminology. So I'm gonna explain to you what I mean when I use terms like information architecture, and that's going to set the stage for the content later on in the presentation. So, in my opinion, the term information architecture is often used in many contexts, right? It's often used to describe the process for arranging menus in a website. Here, I want to use this term in the context of foundational design. So when we architect, we create a system and a set of principles to enable a solution to be delivered that meets a set of business needs, right? The information part of this term provides a clue as to what those business needs are. In this case, it's the ability for people in our organization to navigate and interact with this information. Therefore, the definition of information architecture is essentially it's a creation of a framework and a set of principles that determine the organization and relationships between content and functionality in a shared information environment. Put that up on the wall, make it clear, write it down, communicate it, create your own definition, but agree or come to a consensus on it. Principles are very important, right? Principles really serve as the foundation for any architecture work, right? Principles are defined before you design any system or process. And when you're looking at deploying a product like Microsoft Teams, you still need to undertake that process of defining principles. And if you go Googling, there are plenty of prominent information architects out there who will say, here are my 6 principles, here are my 10 principles, pick and choose whatever you feel is best. Microsoft Teams provides a way for you to access content out of the box, right? How that content is structured and how Microsoft Teams might access that information is up to you within your enterprise. So the principles can help steer the rules by which those systems operate. So in short, it's a code of laws for how information should be organized and assessed. And these laws are important because we expect the solutions that follow to abide by them. I'd also like to talk about the terms requirement and solution. And I think, back in the days when I was a SharePoint developer in the dark ages before the cloud was a thing, it was common to hear SharePoint referred to as a solution desperately looking for a problem or a requirement. And this was in relation to the fact that SharePoint was pushed so heavily into businesses at the time. It was, could do everything. It was new. People were subsequently having been licensed or given it basically for free. They were struggling to make it fit. So we can talk about requirements in terms of what the business needs to achieve. That's business requirements, and what we require technology to be able to do in order to meet that business need. So there are 2 groups of requirements here. Business requirements, what business problems is your organization trying to solve? What are the challenges people are having, and how do they propose to resolve those? And what do we expect Microsoft Teams to be able to do, either out of the box or through some level of configuration, to meet that requirement? And all too often, those statements that, this is what we're looking to do, this is how Microsoft Teams solves that problem, that's often overlooked, and it can result in confusion over when to use Teams versus other products in your enterprise. So a simple mission statement around, you're looking to do this, here's what we recommend you do, this is why Teams is good for that particular scenario. Simple as that. So all too often I see organizations lead into solutions or target state environments with solution requirements, or even statements along the lines of, we require Microsoft Teams, right? Which isn't really a requirement. Microsoft Teams is a solution. So it's a good idea, I think, to take a step back. The solutions are then subsequently determined by your business requirements, right? So the solution requirements essentially form the acceptance criteria for any target state solution. And these solutions might create many containers, for example, into which content resides. So requirement and solution. And finally, there's a new term which you might not be familiar with, which I want to introduce you to, and that is digital footprint. So it's important for this process because we want to try and understand the content that comprises the things or the entities and the things we work with in the business. You know, where's that content stored? Where's the source of truth? How is it related? Is it duplicated? Is it consistent? Things like that. So the digital footprint consists of all the content and containers for information pertaining to any entity in your organization, and they may often span many solutions. So what is the digital footprint for a customer? That's not just documents, that might be conversations, it might be security groups, it might be logs, other metadata. So try and scope the digital footprint for the things, the entities, the objects that you work with within your organization. And there's a relationship between all of those things. So in the scenario I'm going to cover in this presentation, we had an organization that was spread across many Office 365 tenants, right? And Microsoft Teams was seeing use in all of those tenants. We had an objective to try and consolidate all of that into a single unified tenant, if you like. Transformation's often technology driven, but in this example, the catalyst was really that need to bring everybody together in a single collaborative ecosystem, so a single Office 365 tenant. We went into this process knowing that Microsoft Teams was going to be a focal point for the collaboration, but it didn't detract from the need to lay down some foundations up front to ensure that information that we had could be managed effectively. So just as an aside, it's interesting to consider the view that the products like Microsoft Teams are constraints in that, sometimes you might have to rescope or reshape a requirement to ensure that the solution fits in the interest of time, cost, or even your posture on the ability to innovate. So what we saw was that there was a widespread use of traditional methods to classify and categorize content. So by that I meant a lot of manually going in and clicking through SharePoint sites. There was a lot of dependency on metadata. There wasn't any consistency there. And so we at a very, very high level, we had, and you can swap this out for any system that you might use, but we had a strategic CRM platform called Salesforce, right? And that really managed, and this is all related to customers, but that was really around opportunity management. So we have opportunities for customers, and those opportunities either result in work or they don't. But that's where the opportunities is essentially managed. The middle layer was really a combination of SharePoint Online and Teams. So at some point, everybody moved away from SharePoint Online sites, modern sites, into Microsoft Teams as a way to manage engagements and agreements. So an engagement is a piece of work that we do for a customer. An agreement is a managed services agreement. So it's a support contract, if you like, with a particular customer. And this might, may not reflect your own organization, but I'm just sort of walking you through the process that applies to, in our case, customer information. And then finally, we had a bespoke solution here, which was really around stories or case studies. So an engagement or an agreement would yield a story. Some of those stories would be translated into case studies that we can potentially share with other customers. So really, if I was to look at what a customer was in this ecosystem, it's really defined as opportunities, engagements, agreements, and stories, of which case studies are a type. So we took that. Oh, sorry, I'm just jumping ahead here. Go back. So we took that and we mapped it out. So the term customer actually meant something different in each of those systems. We often used synonyms like account or client or even logo, and that would frequently cause confusion in conversations. So we made sure that each term had a universal definition. If we look at the content, we had to look at where content was being put in. So the concept of a person really enumerates the various roles that are associated with working with customer data. Again, this might differ within your organization, but we had the concept of a digital service partner or an account manager, somebody who led the engagement, a service delivery manager to lead the agreement, consultants who worked on delivering outcomes, engineers who fixed problems and ensure that the managed service agreement was endorsed. And then finally, guests, which represent customers actually proactively participating within our tenant and creating content. With the stories, we divided those into 3 subcategories: internal, public, or case studies. And we can see here the relationships between that content. A person here is actually creating content in 4 different locations. So Salesforce for the opportunities, SharePoint or Teams for the engagement or agreement collateral, and then the Story Hub for stories. And when we looked at it, we found it was pretty much all person generated. So in your organization, some of the content might be systems generated. And then what we did is we went through and we made sure, as well as ensuring that each term had an enterprise-wide definition, we enumerated the attributes. Now, when you look at creating attributes or metadata for an entity, so there are 4 entities here, right, that comprise what we mean by customer. And a customer can have many opportunities, engagements, agreements, and stories associated with it. And each one of those entities that you see listed on there, in your organization, make sure each entity and attribute has a business requirement underpinning it. Otherwise, challenge the need for that attribute. So that person that goes nuts, creating all sorts of metadata in SharePoint, ask why, if it's not apparent. Why does all of that metadata exist? And what business requirement or outcome is it mapped to? I think that's an important thing. Generally, we have attributes for things like filtering and searching and sorting activity. Attributes can also inform relevancy in search engines. What we see here is we see the same attributes popping up in disparate systems. So these 4 entities represent the 4 systems into which content can go. We've segregated it by attributes and by document types, but you can see things like ID and customer name pop up quite often. And what are the implications if that information is inconsistent in those 4 systems there? Each system had its own concept of an ID as well. So there was an ID. Those IDs don't actually mean the same thing. Each system had its own way of uniquely identifying an opportunity, an engagement, an agreement, or a story. In my view, and it's the general view of any information architect, a global unique identifier is needed so that across all of those systems, we can uniquely identify a customer. It's key. That will play an important role when we start to exchange information between those systems. It also allows us some level of tolerance in terms of being able to vary or check, as undesirable as that is. Moving referential integrity to system identifiers like IDs and things like that, as opposed to names or mutable data, it actually makes the solution more robust. And then it's down to other measures as to how you keep those values consistent, like master data management, for example. So global IDs are very important. If you do not have a way of globally identifying an entity across multiple systems, look at creating one. I would say don't lean on internal identifiers used by systems. Create your own, and then have you can extend the schema in SharePoint and in Salesforce and in most products Dynamics, so you can model additional attributes like a global identifier. You see those choice attributes that are listed there. Some of them are like visibility. There are a few others, billing country. When you see a choice attribute like that, that normally manifests as a term set. So term sets are lists of values that form a taxonomy. Generally, it's an ongoing challenge, I think, for organizations to manage term sets in an enterprise and keep them consistent. So you have systems that really do, they have local, I would say, local taxonomy management, and it's necessary to run some kind of automation to manually update them or keep them consistent. And I think the closest thing that SharePoint has to that is probably the managed metadata service and the term set, the term store. But yes, I think in all of this, the challenge of keeping taxonomy consistent and replicating that across systems, even if you have SQL Server, master data management. I mean, there isn't really, in my view, there isn't really a solution yet to enable that. There isn't anything in Azure that I'm aware of that you can stand up to effectively manage that, like a master data service. You still have to stand up your own service on infrastructure as a service or on-prem to run that. So that's an area where I think we need to do a bit of, as an industry, make a little bit of more of an investment. So I'm going to move on and talk about the toolbox in terms of, given all of that, and given that we wanted to try and create this concept of a customer site where information pertaining to a customer across all of those 4 entities, opportunities, engagements, agreements, and stories, where all of that can be surfaced, we need to look at the capabilities of the technology at our disposal. So if I look at Microsoft Teams, and I'll quickly go through and explain all of these bits and bobs. So the first thing we have with Microsoft Teams is the idea that there is a security group associated with it. So all of these things are in our arsenal. We can do things with these as part of the final solution, and maybe we can store properties there. Maybe we can use the naming conventions or the construct to try and capture relationships or trying to keep things consistent. So we've got this idea that there is a group of people, a unified group underneath that team. And that unified group has an associated mailbox with it. So that's something that we could potentially leverage. It's also worth knowing that every team has its own SharePoint site collection. So all the things, and I mean this, all the things that you can do with a regular SharePoint Online site collection, you can actually do with a Teams site collection. And that's going to be very useful for us in terms of how we might manage security or how we might categorize the teams that we create. Thirdly, we have this concept of a channel. A channel is a container within a team in which a disparate chat can be had, and in which particular documents can be managed. And you can actually make those channels private if you wish. So a big pushback on converging groups to work within a single team is often, but I don't want these people to see my stuff, and I want to be able to have full autonomy. So private channels really opened up the possibility that 2 teams could potentially coexist under a single team, or sub-teams could work with some level of privacy within a single team, which makes things, it opens up more possibilities. Connectors are, I think, are really important because that's the gateway to the rest of your organization. So there are several out-of-the-box connectors. You can build your own. In the example that you saw previously, we had Salesforce as a CRM system, essentially. There is a connector for Salesforce. It transpires that in our particular implementation, we had a firewall sitting between Salesforce and Teams that we couldn't lift. So we had to build our own connector for Salesforce, if you like, that wasn't really a Salesforce connector, but it allowed us to retrieve and interact with information from that system. So if you don't want to spend a lot of money on development, I would say look at the out-of-the-box connectors, and at a very simple way, they can bring related information into your Teams experience. So if you have a customer site or a customer team, which is what we were trying to build, that team can be associated with an opportunity or an account in Salesforce, and the team can receive updates pertaining to that account or the opportunities associated with it within the chat window there, within the general channel. Tabs actually is another way of providing a view into another system. You can create very simple single page applications that display information from other systems and merely surface those in the Teams experience there. And when the idea here is that you need to be able to provide those pages with some context in order for the right information to be retrieved. So it goes back to my point about customer ID being very important here. We can use the customer ID to call a service to get us all the relevant information around that customer, and that allows many teams to essentially share a single page, but for the information on that page to be contextual. I think we've done enough. People are quite familiar with bots, and they just represent an alternative way to search for and find information. I'm going to be talking about Microsoft Search a little bit later in the session, and I think bots is one of the ways in which we can interact with that information. There's also labeling. I'll talk about labeling in terms of the solution, and I'll differentiate between classification labels, sensitivity labels, and retention labels. And then finally, this is a feature of Teams that people don't really know about, which is the ability to create tags. And I'll explain how we use tags in the solution for customer sites, and why it's quite a useful thing to have. We're also going to leverage some more of the wider Microsoft 365 capability. Microsoft Search is very interesting because there's a huge investment there at the moment, and only recently has the capability been launched to allow you to insert things into it. So index content from other systems into the Microsoft Search experience, and I'm going to talk you through how that works. The Graph API is the gateway, if you like, into Microsoft Search. People who've used Delve will be familiar with the Graph and what that is. Power Automate or Logic Apps represent the automation side of things. So there may be a requirement as you deploy or build these solutions to automate classification or to automate some of the post-provisioning activity. And I think you need to make an informed decision as to whether you use the Power Platform in the case of Power Automate or Logic Apps. And the difference is really, there's a number of factors. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but it really depends on who's building and maintaining the solution, and whether the solution forms part of a larger development operations capability. So obviously it's easier to package and deploy Logic Apps than it is to package and deploy Power Automate as part of a CI/CD pipeline, for example. So Power Automate is really more towards the citizen developer and empowering the business. Logic Apps is more for the sysadmins and the back office development operations work that goes around keeping the systems in check. So in terms of the solution, I want to talk about four aspects of it. Just go back, sorry. Containers, what I mean by containers and how they form part of a solution. Naming conventions, which I think it's always a popular topic. You know, do we need them? What do they look like? How do we implement them? Search and how we find information, and labels. So in terms of containers, when I refer to a container, it's a logical, so containers in the context of building an Office 365 solution it's a place into which content can go, and it's a place to which you can target a policy, a security or a compliance policy. So when you listen to Microsoft talk about labeling and classification, they'll use the term containers to refer to the things that the label can be applied to. So right off the bat, our customer site is a Microsoft team. Now, where you see the blue sections there, those are attributes, if you like, of the target state. So we make use of customer ID, we make use of team name, and we have this concept on a converted name. So if you want to do some kind of naming convention or translation, as difficult as that is, you could create this variation of a team name. Now, what we decided to do is actually make the converted name the same as the team name, but you might want to vary it. And if you vary it, you have to ensure that it is consistent. The other thing to bear in mind is that when you change the name of a team, you don't change the name of the team's URI or resource location. So immediately the concepts are different. So in my view, you have to differentiate between the team name, which is mutable, which the user can change, and the name that gets put into the URL for the SharePoint site underlying the team when it's created. So even though they might be the same for most of the team's lifetime, they can vary. And so it's important to consider them two separate attributes. So each team has its own SharePoint site collection. The way we capture the metadata is we needed to store this concept of a customer ID within the implementation. And the best way for us to do that, all things considered, is we can make use of this key value pair set in the SharePoint site collection called the property bag. So a developer can, or somebody with PowerShell can interact with that, and they can insert values into it. So we can insert a key value pair into the underlying site collection, and we can say, here's the ID. And then anything that the team uses, any custom component or configuration, or anything that the underlying SharePoint site uses, can make use of that value in the property bag. So think of the property bag as a place where you can stash attributes for the team or for the site. and it's quite useful to know that that exists and it can be used. The other thing we did very consciously was we wanted to categorize or allow search within just customer sites. So teams, you know, you might have a lot of teams in your organization. Only some of those teams will be customer teams. The rest might be collaboration teams, projects, whatever, right? So we needed to be able to differentiate teams by type. And what you can do as a post-provisioning activity is you can create an association between the team's underlying SharePoint site collection and the hub. So all of the customer sites belong to a customer site hub, and the hub provides great advantages in that you can immediately out of the box, you have a scope search, so you can search for content within any customer site that you have access to, and you can also find customers. Essentially, if the customer sites represent a customer, you have a customer search function straight away. And that's a sort of out of the box solution. You don't have to create a directory, you know, it's all available for you. So we're less concerned with the ability to filter aesthetic changes and headers and footers and things like that. For the customer hub here, we really wanted to have that out of the box scoped search that just looked at content that was pertaining to customers and just looked at customer sites, a site scoped search. So my tip to you is consider connecting the SharePoint sites that underpin your teams to hubs to provide quickly provide unified search experiences. Within the SharePoint site, and within the team, we have this concept of channels, and channels are really, there are other containers here. There's a general channel that maps to a general folder in the shared documents library of the site, and each time you create a channel, it creates a new folder in the underlying SharePoint Online site. It's worth noting that when you create the channel and convert it to a private channel, SharePoint does something very funky behind the scenes and actually moves the entire folder to a different location. So private channel folders do not coexist with public channels, which is the default. And so therefore, we wanted a channel to represent an engagement or an agreement. So there is no limit to the number of agreement or engagement channels you have, but rather than saying an engagement or an agreement is a new site, is a new project, is a new team, we said no, we want all of our engagements to be grouped under a particular customer. Therefore, it makes sense to have them be channels as opposed to sites or other constructs. Next, we had to look at the security groups. So these represent more containers. We have this concept. So in SharePoint, so the key thing to remember here is that SharePoint has its own role groups that it manages, right? Which is why those role groups are sort of bucketed up with the site there. And there are 3 roles out of the box: owners, members, and visitors, right? Teams falls back on its own 3 role groups that are different to SharePoint's role groups. With teams, you have owners, members, and guests. And what happens when you create a Microsoft team is that it creates a unified group for that team under the covers, and that represents a security principle that you can assign to something to give permission, right? So the Azure Active Directory generates the owners, members, and guests group based on some logic. So in Active Directory, you can determine if somebody owns a team because their owner ID attribute will be in that group listing, in that access control list, will be a value, will not be null. So it automatically knows, and it's using Azure Active Directory. It knows who owns the group and it knows who the members are, and it can simply enumerate on user type equals guest within that unified group to determine who the guests are. So all of that logic, if you like, is managed in Azure Active Directory. That is replicated to Microsoft Teams, and as a result, you get your owners, members, and guests listed in your team membership within the Microsoft Teams client. It's also worth noting that, and we found this during the COVID with the slower services. It takes time in cases of a slow service to replicate changes from Azure AD through to Teams. So Teams isn't directly backing onto Azure AD. It's periodically replicating information from Azure AD to inform its own group membership. What we also have is we have this. So you know, that team name is granted access to the members group in SharePoint, And then we had a couple of other groups that we formed part of the solution. So we had this concept of a group into which everybody belonged. And then we had this concept of a group. It was a dynamic, I've said security group here, but it was a dynamic security group, but it was a guests group. Now you can create groups for guests, and you can create groups for each organization's guests, and you can do that creating dynamic security groups in Azure AD. We had a requirement, which was we wanted everybody in the organization to be able to see the content that people in teams were generating within customer sites. By default, the content is restricted to the people in the team, but what you can do is modify the underlying permissions in SharePoint to open up the content which sits in SharePoint with the private channels excluded. You can open up that content to other people in your organization. So you don't necessarily need to add them to the team. You can add them or create role assignments within the SharePoint role groups and add all staff or all authenticated users, or even in our case, you know, guests from a specific organization. You can give them access to that content. What that does is it allows them to then search for all the content using the customer site hub, which was something we wanted to do. Finally, within Microsoft Teams, we had a couple of connectors. So obviously there was a connector to Salesforce that was going to use the customer ID to go and retrieve pertinent customer information from that platform. And we also wanted to implement a search service. So I'll talk about search later, but you know, we had to present the Microsoft search capability, if you like, within the Teams experience. The final thing was around tags. So just quickly, so a tag is a moniker that you can assign to somebody in the team. So a typical scenario is I'm in a customer site, or I'm working with a customer, and I don't necessarily know who the service delivery manager is. If it's a particularly large team, I might not know who the account manager or the digital services partner is. So you can assign tags to people in the team, like project manager or analyst, you know, roles, if you like. And then people can use the @ convention. So I could say, you know, I can jump into a team. I'm not familiar with the team. I'm not familiar with the customer. I could say @SDM, where can I find relevant material, for example? And that will just automatically resolve to the person who fulfills that role. So if I know roles, but I don't know people, then that's a really useful thing to have. And I'd suggest you go and read up on the use of tags, because it can really help enrich solutions, especially in cases where the teams are relatively large. So do go and look at tags and look at creating some of your own in the teams that you use. Naming conventions. So we looked at naming conventions, and we started off thinking that we needed one, and then we agreed subsequently that we didn't. The principal blocker around naming conventions is the fact that, you know, and this is a fundamental truth, right? I don't think you should put anything in front of Microsoft Teams. Don't put anything in front of that join or create team function, right? Naming conventions are a fallback position. So why are they necessary? I mean, service administrators in particular like them because it creates, you know, visual indicators or patterns, and those can be used to categorize or differentiate data for tasks like auditing or reporting. In reality, though, if you're going to push for a naming convention, it will be a challenge, I think, to enforce consistency, especially if the attributes that you're trying to keep consistent can be changed or modified by the end users. So previously I referred to the fact that, you know, at any point in time, somebody can change a team name, right? That means you're going to probably invest in post-deployment automation, cleanup scripts, and you're going to create a mess for yourself. So what we did in this particular case is we looked at some of the fundamental requirements. We looked at what the possible solution could be, and then we looked at whether or not we felt that that would have a real impact, that if we didn't implement naming conventions, it would cause us some kind of a problem. So the first requirement that's really related to naming conventions is we wanted people to be able to create a team of any type. That applies to everybody, and the solution there is go and create one. Just offer the self-service capability in Microsoft Teams, let them go and create their teams. The impact without having a naming convention, that's fine. You know, it doesn't really affect things, doesn't prevent, a naming convention doesn't impede or negate the possibility people will do that. The second thing is we wanted service administrators to be able to identify the teams in Azure AD by type. Now, we haven't really bottomed this out yet, so I'm giving you the current state of affairs. That can be challenging because there's nothing to differentiate the teams that relate to customers other than the customer name from any other differentiator. So if you're looking at a big long list in Active Directory and you're trying to report on customer sites, For a service admin in Azure AD, it becomes quite challenging. That said, there is a feature in Azure called the cognitive search, which allows you to create a searchable index of content, and the service admins can run searches against that. So although it doesn't help with filtering views of groups in CSV files or even in the admin portal, it can provide a way to scope search to only the types of teams that represent customers. We wanted to be able to enumerate teams by type using calls to the Teams or SharePoint API. So that applies to anybody that might be building solutions for customer sites. The way we sorted that out was just to say, look, let's just add customer ID into the site collections property pack. That satisfies the requirement. We don't need to implement a naming convention. Developers can say, get me all teams where or get me all SharePoint sites where the underlying customer ID is not null. And that could give us the information that the developers needed. We wanted people to find a team by any type. I've already talked about the fact that you can discover teams or create teams natively, so the self-service capability. You can also this is what we did, you can also assign teams to hub sites. So if we wanted people to find a customer site, for example, we could say go and run a search in the hub and just switch to the sites vertical within that search, and that will just enumerate the customer sites that match the search term that you've provided. And you could do that with other types of team because they all back onto SharePoint sites. Searching within teams, again, that's something that we can do with hub sites. And as you saw previously, we actually assigned general everybody groups to the content underpinning the team to allow that content to be within the scope of people's search. So we didn't want to restrict access to the content. Now you can make that read-only access, or you can make it member or read-write access. It doesn't matter, pick or choose, but if you don't have access to see that content, it will not be surfaced when you run a search. So we obviously, if you want to run a search within your teams, you can do that within the Teams portal. But if you wanted to run a universal search for content across all of the customer sites, you'd have to run a search in the hub site, and you would have to make sure that the users in the groups had the appropriate assignments created for them in SharePoint to allow them to see that content. We wanted to, this was a requirement I actually pushed back on, but a business requirement is a requirement nonetheless. People felt it was important and were able to rationalize it, which was, if somebody sends me a link to something, I want to be able to inspect that link and work out where that link is from. I suppose it can help in like phishing scenarios and things like that. But given that the team name is essentially the customer name, we felt that there was enough in the URI to allow somebody to know the team name, even if that changes. There are some exceptions. Sometimes the URL can just be gobbledygook. There isn't really much we can do about that. But if we can present some human readable information in the URLs, we don't need to resort to a naming convention. We can just get away with the customer name here. The final requirement, I think, is to visually distinguish a team by type. We wanted everyone to be able to do that. So this is about putting something in the team to say, this is a customer site or this is a collaboration site. There are two options available to us. We can either use classification labels, which are on the way out, or sensitivity labels, which are on the way in, I suppose. And that gives you a little label there that you can look at when you're in the team. And sensitivity labels can also help to enforce decisions on where content should go, because they enforce policy. They can result in things like tooltips. So search is a relatively new field here. What I'm going to show you is currently in beta, and it's based on an exercise that's being run internally within our organization here to look at how we surface some of those entities like stories and opportunities that aren't native to SharePoint or Office 365. How can we incorporate those into the searches that people run to ensure that they become part of the search results, or that they become verticals within that search experience? So Microsoft Search currently is, when you run a search from portal.office.com, or when you run a search from the Office toolbar, that includes when it's in SharePoint or in other Office apps, that's going to run a Microsoft search, and you'll see verticals around sites, documents, people. I think there's one other I can't remember, but it's the closest thing to enterprise, the traditional enterprise search experience, right? Now, what you can do is you can extend and customize that search experience now, and I'm going to sort of walk you through the process here. So the real question here is, I guess I get asked this a lot, is do we still need SharePoint metadata, right? SharePoint metadata is useful when you're doing list level sorting and filtering, but most of the time people are interacting with content via search, right? The important thing to note is that Delve and the Office Graph do use managed properties. That's metadata that you're using to filter in search. It does use SharePoint metadata if that metadata is managed properties. So it does incorporate that in terms of relevancy. Delve uses managed properties to display query the graph, it displays content cards in Delve, and you can actually see some of the managed properties like author, file name, modified by, for example, in the Delve content cards. So Microsoft Search, the API for it is currently in preview, and the first step really is to create a connector in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So we created a connector that represented the external system that we're getting information from. In this case, it was StoryHub, and we then had to subsequently define a schema for that connection. So that's really, and you do this via the admin portal. You specify the attributes you want to retrieve in the search results, and it supports, I think, up to a maximum of 64. So each connection represents, or a connector represents, a vertical in your search results. So we are introducing a new vertical or dimension, or what did they used to call it in SharePoint? It used to be called a scope, a result source, called StoryHub. And the process is really, it's all communicated using JavaScript or JSON object notation. What you can see here is just an example of the construct, or the way in which that information is represented when it's passed to the Graph API. So the connector, when we create the connector, it creates an endpoint for us in the API. So you can see here the URL at the top there, it says /external/connections/StoryHub. So the connector is really an API that we can then talk to start putting data into the index. So step one is create your connection. Step two is define your schema. And then step three is really populate the index. So we call the indexing service. There's a create external item indexing service. So you can see here the overall solution looks like this. We have the system that we want to get data out of, which is StoryHub. We then have a logic app that runs on a schedule that you can define. It gets information from StoryHub. It then iteratively calls create external item using the StoryHub connector to populate the index. So that's your indexing process there. And then the end result of that is you end up with a new vertical in your search experience. So it was news, the thing that I missed out. So files, people, sites, news, and now stories. We can now search on stories, and that's surfacing information from our external system here. And as you can see, we can chop and change the way that information looks and make it pretty and make it carded and all that sort of stuff. So you have the potential there to really augment that search experience. And that's really going to come into the fold when we have things like Cortana, Project Cortex, which is around the corner. So for those that don't know, Project Cortex is going to overhaul the way Delve works. And I think it's going to coincide with a huge investment in Microsoft Search. So we're making an investment here. We certainly recommend that other people think about how to use that to bring information together. The final thing I want to cover just before we finish today is around labeling. So there are three types of labels which I just want to differentiate. There is classification labels. So these came in before unified labeling and before sensitivity labels were a real thing. A classification label was something that you could define and then tag a team with. So you could create a classification label called confidential and assign it to a team, and then there would be a little visual indicator in the team that would tell you. The downside with those classification labels was that you couldn't enforce any kind of policy around them. They were there just as a visual indicator. It's still possible to create classification labels, but really where we think people should be looking now is in the creation of sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels are assigned to containers like sites and groups. They work across Outlook, Teams, SharePoint Online. They're enforced by apps, Office apps like PowerPoint and Outlook. And so, you know, for any entity, we know that the digital footprint includes documents, list items, chats, right? All of that stuff's in different silos, different applications, but the containers for those all support sensitivity labeling. So it's possible for us to apply a single label that works across all of that content. You decide on the language you want to use for your labels. So, you know, you could default to the ISO 27001, you know, confidential, internal, public. Note that ISO doesn't prescribe any particular levels of classification. It just mandates standards for classification, labeling, and handling of information. You could use, you could create a label called customer site if you wanted, and that label could involve, there could be several variations of that label that enforce different levels of classification. So really the label, the name of the label is important because that's the visual indicator that people are going to get. That's what they're going to see when they go into Teams. So decide on your strategy for how you're going to label name labels. So labels can determine, you know, group privacy, whether external people can collaborate, whether files can be downloaded and things like that. And it's possible for administrators at the back end to sort and search by label, by sensitivity label, and also change those labels on the fly. So all the auditing and all the search and filtering is catered for behind the scenes. Just a couple of terms there that you may not be familiar with. Content marking, that refers to the ability of an application to display labels in the header. The automatic labeling of Office apps refers to, and that was launched in February this year, this refers to the ability to automatically assign labels to the content. There are a number of built-in policies that might, for example, detect the presence of source code, detect certain constructs like resumes in terms of document types, or the use of profanity or aggressive language in documents and things like that. So you can apply that, you can turn that on and use the out-of-the-box rules to help enforce your policy. Last point I'm going to make in the presentation is that within this area and within the idea of classifying or labeling content, there's some really interesting work going on at the moment with Microsoft's AI Builder. And that can be used to analyze content as it's uploaded or published to Office 365. And you can have a process automatically determine what type of content it is, and then based on that automatically classify it. So you have to teach it, obviously, but in the example of a customer site that we're going to use, you know, we could teach AI Builder to identify a statement of work, and it could identify variations on that, as long as we had plenty of examples to train it with. So that's where people are heading right now. That's where the next sort of, in terms of innovation, that's where the next solutions are going to pop up. It's something that I think you should be thinking about and looking at how you get there. But I think all in all, it represents a really interesting way in which that sort of train of thought can go. So in conclusion, I appreciate that was a lot of content. We looked at information architecture and the process to analyze, assess, look at how you're going to deploy things, how content is going to be arranged. We then looked at the various things that you can do in Microsoft Teams and in the wider Office 365 platform as you build your solution using examples. In this case, the example of this concept of a customer site or a location into which you could put customer content. If anybody wants to ask me questions offline or reach out or contact me, please do so. I do have a blog that I don't really update that often because I'm incredibly busy commercially, but I'm hoping to sort of spare some time and start to blog about things like, you know, how do you decommission a Yammer network and all that sort of stuff. So Peter, over to you. I don't know if there are any questions while I was chewing the scenery there, but if there are, I'm happy to answer any questions people might have at this time.
There's no.
No questions? All right, excellent. So look, for those of you that attended, I thank you very much. If the information was delivered rapidly, we will be publishing a recording onto YouTube of this presentation. So I'll make sure that people in the meetup get the link to that. But thank you so much for sparing your lunchtime today and listening to me talk about information architecture. It's a subject that I'm very passionate about. We hope to see you next month. We haven't got a speaker lined up yet, but I will announce as soon as we've got somebody lined up to present to you for the July session of the meetup. Once again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.